On a visit to the nation's capital, no building stands out with more majesty than the U.S. Capitol building. Atop this magnificent building rests a statue, higher than any other statue in D.C. It is the Statue of Freedom. With a green hue and standing 19.5 feet tall and weighing 15,000 pounds, it's a majestic image of a classical female figure with long flowing hair, wearing a Roman like helmet with a crest composed of an eagle's head and feathers, an homage to the Native Americans of the United States. She wears a classical dress secured with a brooch inscribed with the letters US. Over the statue's shoulders is draped a heavy, flowing, toga like robe fringed with fur. Her right hand rests upon the hilt of a sheathed sword wrapped in a scarf. In her left hand, she holds a laurel wreath of victory and the shield of the United States with 13 stripes. She stands on a cast iron pedestal, topped with a globe encircled with the motto E pluribus unum, out of many, one. The lower part of the pedestal is decorated with fasces, symbols of the authority of government, and wreaths. The story behind this beautiful symbol of freedom is more interesting the deeper you dive. By 1850, the Capitol building wasn't big enough to hold the government of the expanding U.S. nation. Work on the north and south wings of the Capitol had just begun. These wings would later hold the modern Senate and House chambers. Thomas Crawford was a well known sculptor from New York that had established a studio in Rome. Construction overseers reached out to him for a design for a statue to sit atop the new Capitol building. After a few iterations, Crawford sculpted a graceful figure in a classical dress wearing a liberty cap encircled with stars, holding a shield, wreath, and sword, which he said represented armed liberty. The design was sent to Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, who was in charge of the overall construction at the Capitol. Davis objected to the Liberty Cap, the symbol of freed slaves, because its history renders it inappropriate to a people who were born free and should not be enslaved. Davis suggested a helmet with a circle of stars. In response, Crawford designed a crested version of a Roman helmet, the crest of which is composed of an eagle's head and a bold arrangement of feathers suggested by the costume of our Indian tribes, Crawford said. This third design was approved by Jefferson Davis in April 1856. As you know, Davis would later become the first and only president of the Confederate States of America. In Rome, Crawford executed the full-size clay model in his studio in Rome and cast it in plaster in 5 major sections. He died suddenly in 1857 before the model left his studio, and his widow shipped the model packed into 6 crates. During the voyage, the ship began to leak and could go no further than Bermuda, where the crates were left in storage until other transportation could finally be arranged and the mold arrived in the United States. $1,200 in 1830 would be about $32,000 today. That is how much craftsman Clark Mills purchased a young man named Philip Reid for. Philip Reid was born into slavery in Charleston, South Carolina around 1820 and was purchased during his youth by iron worker Clark Mills. Mills owned a foundry located in Bladensburg, Maryland, outside Washington, D.C. Mills quickly recognized Philip's skills in ironwork and included him as an essential part of his construction team. Mills was chosen to create the first bronze statue ever cast in the U.S., a likeness of Andrew Jackson on horseback commissioned for Lafayette Park. Mills started a temporary foundry south of the White House in D.C., and with the help of Philip Reid, they completed the statue. The success of this work caused the U.S. government to trust Mills with the Statue of Freedom that needed to be cast. Work on casting the Statue of Freedom began immediately in 1860, or would have, except when the time came to move the plaster model from the Capitol to the foundry for casting. No one knew how to separate it into pieces to be moved, and the Italian sculptor who came with the model refused to help unless given a pay raise. Fortunately, Philip Reid was there. He figured out that by using a pulley and tackle to pull up on the lifting ring at the top of the model, the seams between the sections would be revealed. The statue was successfully separated into its 5 sections and transported to the foundry. Philip worked tirelessly on the Statue of Freedom, almost continuously from July 1860 to May 1861. He worked weeks without a break and without compensation, only receiving pay on the Sundays that he labored on the project. Since Sunday was a traditional rest day for enslaved laborers, Mills agreed to pay him $1.25 a day for his labor on Sundays. Philip worked 33 Sundays and received a total of $41.25 for his efforts. Although other enslaved workers were part of the Capitol construction crew, Philip was the only known enslaved man to work on the statue. I'm sure it crossed the minds of Philip and the other enslaved workmen of the cruel irony of a slave being forced to help cast the Statue of Freedom. Civil War had been fomenting throughout the states for years and finally broke out in 1860. Most wanted to stop construction on the Capitol building and the Statue of Freedom, but Abraham Lincoln would not stop construction. He knew that the people needed to see that the Union would not be put on hold or stopped. It would continue strong and prosperous. It would not be halted. So the work continued. While Philip continued his hard work on the statue, on April 16, 1862, Philip received his freedom when President Abraham Lincoln signed the Compensated Emancipation Act that freed certain slaves held to service or labor in the District of Columbia. In 1863, the Capitol Dome was sufficiently stable and the Statue of Freedom was hoisted in sections to the top of the dome, assembled, and has stood there ever since. And on that day, Philip, a free man, must have watched as the work of his hands, created while he was in slavery, was hoisted as a monument to the nation and to the world that freedom would prevail. Hundreds of thousands of men were dying too at that time to make sure that the symbol of freedom applied to all who lived in this country. Not much more is known about the life of Philip Reid, but he lived in Washington, D.C. the rest of his life and was sure to walk by or gaze out at the Capitol Dome and the unobstructed view of freedom he helped create. No statue in D.C. sits higher than the Statue of Freedom, and by law, no building is built tall enough to obstruct the view of the Capitol. The man who helped make the statue an actual symbol of freedom to the nation, Abraham Lincoln, was shot in April of 1865. He was laid in the newly built Capitol Rotunda as the nation mourned and paid their respects. The rotunda was draped in massive black cloths, and his coffin was placed atop a funeral platform, a catafalque, that is still used to this day for figures who pass on and lay in state in the U.S. Capitol. Lincoln's body lay in the rotunda directly beneath the Statue of Freedom that stood as a testament of the price of freedom. The historical record provides only a few glimpses into Philip Reid's life after the Civil War. He remained a Washington resident and became a plasterer, where he completed walls for local businesses and homes. The 1880 U.S. Census listed Washington, D.C. born Mary P. Reid as his wife, and the couple had a 2-year-old child named Henry Reid. Philip and his family spent the remainder of his life living in different parts of the Black community of Southwest Washington, D.C. The original plaster model of the Statue of Freedom rests in the Capitol Visitor Center to this day.